Well, good morning, and thank you for that introduction. Actually, the whole "he needs no introduction" thing, frankly, just isn't true. I recently was, rather astonishingly, elected the president of the John Lewis Partnership Council, and about 6 weeks after I started in that role, I went into the Oxford Street store, which is our flagship store. We've got, with Waitrose, something like 400 stores. Anyway, I went in the biggest one, and I went into menswear, actually to buy a new suit for my first partnership council, and two young black selling assistants, I could see, were kind of observing me. And of course, what it transpired is that they'd seen a photograph of the new president on the cover of the in-house Gazette. And one of them came up to me and he said, my friend and I had been talking, you're the new president, aren't you? I said, yeah. And he said, could you tell me your name? Because I think you're that bloke you were some kind of politician or the Equality Commission thing, weren't you? But my friend says that the new president is Howard from the Halifax ads on TV. So I've been telling that story for about 10 years, and it's amazing how actually every 6 months it happens again. And it's just extraordinary. May I just say, by the way, hello to Trinidad and Tobago. If I'd known this was happening, I'd have demanded that I delivered this from the other end of the line. And may I also say, Nora, it's I feel that Ghulam's presence is missed here, actually. Oddly enough, he wouldn't, I think, have been at this podium, where he would have been sitting in the front row all day, observing and listening and urging us on. But so I'm going to imagine him being here. Now, I'm grateful for the invitation. I don't do this kind of thing all that much these days. I used to do it a lot as chair of the EHRC. I'm quite glad I don't do that anymore, because being confused with different people or being called just about, I used to start about this time of year where I'd get 100 phone calls a day as Christmas approaches, because being the official adjudicator on cultural and ethnic questions, I'd get the question starting now every day, 100 times a day: is it okay to celebrate Christmas, and can teachers say that it has something to do with the baby Jesus without offending Muslim parents? So we can get it out there now. Jesus, fine. We're cool. It's a privilege to contribute to these discussions, and the topics couldn't be more timely. And by the way, may I just say, I'm delighted that in spite of everything that I read in the newspapers every day, it's possible to speak an academic gathering without the meeting being disrupted or subject to some kind of ban because someone's decided to be offended before they've heard what anybody else has to say. Now, what we're addressing is the issue of how we can make equality a reality, especially in the workplace, and some of the challenges thrown up to our orthodox notions of equality by diversity. Now, we know, and I will just say this briefly, I don't think I have to argue in this forum the value of diversity. My Earth story, I guess, is that in 2009, Yahoo came up with a new innovation in which you could use your smartphone to upload videos. It was absolutely revolutionary at the time. It was going to change everything, and in fact, it was a fantastic piece of kit. They launched it. It worked, except that the feedback started to come back that there was a bit of a glitch. Some of the videos that people were uploading were being uploaded upside down. And they put all the clever boys in, by the way, it is boys, in Silicon Valley to work on this. Nobody could find an answer. They got everybody together, sat down and said, what the hell's going on? How come, we've got all the talent in the world, how can't we fix this? Well, somebody who is really clever, mathematician probably, said, well, what proportion? 10% being uploaded the wrong way around. 10%, 10%. 10%. Could it be something to do with the fact that 10% of the one random figure you can get, that's 10%, 10% of humanity is left-handed. And of course, it transpired that left-handed people pick up their phones the opposite way to right-handed people, and that's the reason it's being uploaded the wrong way around. The point of that story for this morning is that, of course, they also, being really smart, looked at who was on the design development team. Not a single left-hander amongst them. Nobody thought, actually, that there might be a different way of handling your phone. So cost gazillions. Of course, it then worked, but the case for diversity seems to me absolutely proven in that one anecdote. We're going to have to deal with more of it. We've seen graphically this summer what's happening at Europe's margins in the Mediterranean. Those scenes represent just the start of an immense demographic change in our continent, one by the way that Africa's been facing for some time. And the Chinese are embracing the Chinese Communist Party plans to move 250 million people from the land to the cities over the next decade. And though in this country we tend to think of Chinese as just Chinese, as my equivalent when I was in public office told me, we're talking about 150 different kinds of people with many, many languages and many, many different cultures. And their question actually came to see me, say, how do you deal with this integration question? I said, at that scale, mate, you are absolutely on your own. I cannot tell you anything that is going to be useful for you. But these migrations aren't just an economic and social issue. They bring serious religious and cultural dilemmas in their wake. Today, there are 44 million Muslims in Europe. By 2050, that number is going to be 71 million, some 1 in 10 of the continent's population. Here in the UK, the visible minority population will rise from the current 13% to between 25 and to 35% by 2050. Some cities, Birmingham, Leicester, for example, will be over 50% non-white British. London already feels like a different country to, say, Northumbria or Kent or Norfolk. According to Peter Rees, who is the leading demographer of this kind of thing, we can expect more than half of Britain's districts, Philip Rees, I beg your pardon, to become more like London, and the other half will be very different in character. I think this presents us with 3 major challenges, which is what I want to address this morning. First of all, acquiring cultural intelligence. The new jargon is CQ. Second, managing integration. And thirdly, what I describe rather clumsily, but I can't think of a better way of putting it, the dilemma of difference. So let me start with the cultural intelligence question. I do some work with EY. My colleague Aaron Buttrell, who runs the National Equality Standard, will talk this afternoon about some of the work we're doing there. But it's an issue that the firm is very, and I think Liz Bingham is going to be speaking as well. It's an issue the firm's really getting into. It's really putting its muscle and putting its normal way of approaching problems into this question of diversity. An EY executive who'd worked in India twice told me, I thought it gave me a very good insight. She said the first time she was there, they really couldn't make any headway. And that was because they later thought they just didn't understand India and they couldn't get on terms with the business language. They didn't know what people meant when they said yes or when they said no or maybe and so on. The second time, they engaged someone to work with them who was actually not Indian but understood India much better. And as a consequence, they now think, they made enormous headway. And she made this point. She said, we will invest $500 million in making sure that the machines in London speak to the machines in Delhi, that we have the same code, we have the same computer language and so on. But we forget that we can invest 100,000 in making sure that people in Delhi and London understand in the same way what the machines are telling them. That is the real meaning of cultural intelligence. I think people sometimes now think it's about knowing what the different festivals are. That's not the point. The point is in globalized economies, can we understand how these differences work? And we're going to have to understand them domestically too. In my company, we have a little acronym which we call the cultural ICE, by which we mean inheritance, codes of behavior, and environment. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that we tend to think that differences are ones that get ironed out if people just talk to each other, and bit by bit we get to know each other and it'll all be lovely and melting potty and all that stuff. Well, actually, the world doesn't work like that, and thank God it doesn't. We are different. We hold on to our differences. That is actually the point of diversity, and we rather like our differences. But they give rise to friction, and we have to understand each other's languages. And the point I really want to make at this stage is that they don't automatically go away. We can see this. We've done, with my colleague at Trevor Phillips, Richard Webber, who's Professor of Demography, those of you who use the Mosaic geodemographic systems or ACORN will know his name because he was the developer of those systems. We did some work ahead of the Scottish Referendum, which everybody thought was going to be a 60-40 result. It turned out, of course, to be 55-45. We thought it would be 60-40. We did some analysis about the cultural identity of Scots, and anybody who knows Scotland will know that Scots aren't just Scots. There are 7 or 8 tribes up there. We calculated that the result would be more like 55-45, which is nearer what it turned out to be. Not because we were clever, but because we observed that there was one particular tribe in Scotland who would describe themselves as working class Scots, particularly, but not exclusively in the west of Scotland, but who actually are the descendants of a particular group, Irish Catholics. If you look at the census, about 1% of Scots will tick themselves as Irish Catholics. Actually, about 10% of them are descended from that group. Why is this significant? Well, there are 2 things that mattered about this group. They are the most Labour-loyal voters anywhere, actually in the UK. So you would have expected them to vote no. Actually, they were the most enthusiastic voters for yes. Why? Well, our hypothesis is this. The reason this group votes Labour is because they do not like Tories, and that's part of their history. And the reason they voted yes was exactly the same reason. They didn't want to stay in a Tory-ruled UK. Now, the reason I make that point is that these are people who are 6 or 7 generations off being Irish Catholics. And they would never in their minds think of themselves in that way. But their behavior tells you something quite different. The same is true, by the way, of Indian heritage voters in England, who are the most likely to vote for the Conservatives. And indeed, the Conservatives were smart about this. They took an extra 1 million voters, largely amongst Indians and Sikhs, in the last election, because they targeted that group. They understood that actually some of the habits of this particular group were very significantly influenced by their history. And I haven't got time to go into this, but essentially what we discovered was that this particular group was more likely, irrespective of which generation, to be detached from the traditional Labour loyalty of minorities. And actually, one of the things that's interesting is that there was a difference between whether these voters lived in a cluster where there were a lot of other Indians, clusters where there are not a lot of Indians. But the essential, and the reason I make that point, is that the third element of our cultural ICE is environment. We found that there was a 20-point difference in the likelihood of voting Conservative, depending on whether you lived in an Indian cluster, less likely, or you lived outside an Indian cluster, 20 points more likely to vote Conservative. So inheritance, culture, environment, important. I want to say, by the way, there are different ways of creating these cultural categories religion. In the United States, they talk a lot now about background. So, for example, George Akerlof, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, has done a fantastic study about the identity of the United States Marines. Anybody who knows the Marines know that the central thing they do is when you become a Marine, they strip you of everything else. Your background, your geography, your race, your religion, and they inject you with Marine-ness, which is why any Marine you meet on almost any topic will respond in roughly the same way. It becomes the prevailing identity for them. And by the way, companies have their culture. As I mentioned, I'm associated with one which has an astoundingly strong company culture. So, for example, in John Lewis and Waitrose, we have a rule: you never, ever point the customer to where he or she wants to go. You take them there. And you will notice, those of you who go into those stores, unlike other brands, who I won't mention, they will point you. In our stores, you will always be taken. And by the way, I'm an important guy, I think, in that if I'm in the store with a branch manager, somebody comes up to us and says, where are the napkins? Within a heartbeat, he'll drop me at the fish counter and say, I'm going with a customer. So these cultures are really, really strong. So what I want to say in the little time I have left is that actually what we're talking about today is how we are managing and understanding these cultural differences. Now, in this country, we have a variety of ways of dealing with cultural difference, almost all of which involve avoidance or denial. Our top strategy for dealing with these things is to pretend that differences don't exist and exclude any possibility of challenge. Well, you know, I think sometimes now we're slightly out of the place where we can do that. So a second strategy that we've adopted is to tell everybody that the problem's been fixed. I know somebody who's from a nation or a woman or a background or whatever, and they're very important in my company, so actually we've solved this problem. Most of you will have come across that reaction. Not true. The numbers tell you different. And a third, by the way, is to pretend that these differences don't really matter. I'll talk a little later about the issue of the so-called educational miracle in London. But I will just say this: the most significant story about school performance probably anywhere in Europe has been the rise in the last 12 years of London schools from the bottom of the pile to the top. All sorts of reasons have been advanced for this. The one reason that nobody is willing to contemplate, and I've seen government reports, I've been in conferences and so on, is that the change in the composition of London schools has been responsible for it. Despite the fact that, for example, the OECD data this summer shows that migrant children outperform native children by six points overall, and in the UK, the gap is something like is 6 points here. And by the way, in Germany and France, it's even bigger. Germany, it's 27 points. France is 53 points. There are issues about integration and so on, which we do not want to confront. Our fourth strategy for dealing with these issues of difference is to pretend in some way that actually there is a problem, but it's the fault of, in this case, the minority. Una's done some fantastic work in getting the television industry, which has been magnificently sleepy on the issue of diversity, to wake up in the last 3 to 4 years. But even now, it's interesting. I absolve Channel 4 from this. The BBC suffered an onslaught, it can only be called that, by Lenny Henry on its record about leading roles in comedy and drama, executive roles and so on. The BBC's response has been to launch an apprentice scheme. So actually the problem here is not that the corporation has somehow got the answer. It is that somehow we need to teach the minorities how to be as good as the people who are there already. I mean, really, how insulting can you get? Now, I think I understand some of the reasons for avoidance. These issues are risky, they're potent. You get it right and nobody much cares. You get it wrong and you're in big trouble. the story of Benedict Cumberbatch trying to say something important about the absence of minority actors in leading roles. What do we remember now about that controversy? Not that Cumberbatch was trying to raise something. He frankly didn't need to. I mean, he's one of the biggest actors in the world. He's punting his movie. He doesn't need to say anything about this stuff, but he did. But what do we remember? He used the wrong word. Now, and I've discovered since then that a lot of industry leaders, interestingly enough, they observe that and they worry about speaking out because I want to say the right thing, but if I get it somehow wrong, then actually I'm going to take a step backwards and so on. So we have issues to deal with our lack of comfort. We know this in terms of our leadership in our businesses. One of the studies that we do at Green Park is to look at the executive leadership in the Footsie 100. We know that 2 out of 3 executive leaderships in the Footsie 100 are all white. We know that out of the top 10,000 leaders, last year there were 480 who were not white. This year there are 440. We are actually going backwards in this respect, and there are people here, Diane, I see sitting there, helping us to try to find ways to reflect this back at the industry in our 2020 campaign. Now, does all of this matter? Well, I think it does. These differences are not just about bad people discriminating. They are about the way that people behave, how services work for them, and so on. We need to understand some of what's going to be happening in a diverse society. So, for example, we did some work 4 or 5 years ago, Royal Free Hospital, problem about Bangladeshi community, of which there's a substantive one in the catchment area, not keeping appointments. Well, I can't go into the detail of it, I haven't got time, but what we found as part of our research was that it wasn't that they were, didn't understand the system or they were somehow culturally always disposed to be late or anything like that. It was that they have an aversion, that community has an aversion to going to appointments by themselves. There are reasons for this, which I don't fully understand, but it is just a fact of life that actually this particular group doesn't like doing that. Now, it's an issue that we could resolve, and to some extent have resolved quite easily by the way we organise the appointments, the way that we cluster them, and so on. We are looking at this in other areas, and here's a very, very simple one, but it's one of my favourites, and we're working on it right now. Shopping centres. One of the great things about shopping districts is you need to bring people in, and a 0.5% increase in footfall is a lot of money. 2 things matter, and you will know this from your own experience. If you go into a shopping district, you go there because you feel that you are comfortable there. And one of the signals that you are comfortable there is that there are other people like you there. And there is a very, very interesting and tricky balance here, because the single most obvious and first signal of people like me there is what they look like. So actually in the United States, one of the metrics that people look at is what is the tipping point? Because what you see is that a shopping district will change literally its complexion within a year once it reaches a tipping point of the mix. So we study that a lot. But there are practical little things. People have got children and their families, and you go to Brent Cross or Blue Water or wherever it is, and sometimes you've got to sit down with kids. You sit outside McDonald's or Costa, wherever it is. Traditionally, we put tables that accommodate 4 people. In some districts, particularly in this city, can't do that anymore, because for some communities, going shopping is a family event. There are 8 of you. And actually, the worst thing for a shopping district, literally puts people off, is that you don't have anywhere to sit down. They go somewhere else. So we're now having to build this into new shopping centres. Sounds trivial, but it would blow your socks off the amount of money that's involved here. But even in smaller operations, relatively speaking, we've done some work for a very big national charity, turns over about 500 million a year. It does not appeal to minorities in the same way it does to white patrons. Visitor numbers, membership, and so on. We've calculated that if they could bring up their appeal amongst minorities to the average for everybody else, they would this year gain £27 million in income on a 450 million turnover. More importantly, because of the demographic curve, by the middle of this century, that gap will be 70 million a year. So this is becoming big potatoes, and this is really all about how we manage integration. The question is, how do we do it? That's my second point. Now, I'm not going to go through the detail. I learned about this very early because I lived in a country, my family comes from Ghana, I lived in a country which had a very diverse population, Europeans, Asians, and so on and so forth. I learned some things about the integration game very early on. First of all, integration is an automatic human response to diversity. It's a learned behavior. The learning is inherited or it's not. Secondly, it's a two-way street. It's not just down to the absence of opportunity. Both majorities and minorities have to change, what you might call a dynamic convergence. And thirdly, that it's difficult to tell people what it looks like in practice. Well, I'm not a social scientist by training, I'm a chemist, so I think, generally speaking, in terms of process and numbers. And I want to apologise to mathematicians in the room when I say that I think of integration as a process of dynamic convergence on a single set of basic values, attributes, and behaviour. It's a two-way street where everybody is in motion. The question is, how do we know it when we see it? Well, I always go for something that we can measure, and this is, I guess, the last third of what I want to say. The perfectly integrated society is one in which an individual's life chances, preferences, and behaviours are randomly related with respect to race and religion. A sociologist would say that race and religion carry no explanatory power in predicting outcomes. Or a common shallow journalist like me would say that it means that when I walk into the room, my skin colour, shape of features wouldn't give you a clue as to whether I would be a dustman or a doctor or a bus driver. Well, of course, we don't live our lives through equations. We need to think about what it means in the real world. And the real world challenge now is becoming very, very different for most people for three reasons. First of all, we now understand that we're a composite, each of us, of many things: family history, professions, gender, race, so on, the cultural life I spoke of. Secondly, that as our societies become more affluent, more addicted, I guess, to freedom, a good thing, we want to live our lives in tune with our identities, and that means we want to bring ourselves to work. We are more out there about what we are, celebrating and irritating other people with our difference. We, on the other hand, have individual attitudes that are more tolerant. So we are more open and ready to express our attitudes. And the third, and the thing for me, is that we now have tools that give us more information, more detail about our differences. We know that now that some of the obstacles to our integration aren't invented, they're the result of the gap between the way some of our institutions work and the way some of our citizens want to live. Neither is necessarily at fault. And we also now know it's a very difficult thing for all of the people like us in this room, that some of those differences are inherent. They are not going to go away, nor are they simply symptoms of unequal treatment. Example, Ipsos Mori, study of GP patient opinion, sample of over 100,000 patients, shows that British Muslims, corrected for class and geography, are 40% less likely to rate their GPs as very good than the average person. This is in a service where a third of the doctors and nurses are not white. This is not the result of an alien service. This is about the way that the service operates. So it's a cultural issue. We don't yet know how to address it. we can take some clues from work that's been done. Between 2000 and 2004, the use of A&E in Tower Hamlets doubled. They called in my colleague, Richard Webber, who examined 200,000 attendance records, showing that the overusers were predominantly Bangladeshi. The first assumption, of course, was that this is an immigrant population, didn't know the system, and so on. But what the analysis showed was that the overusers were mostly people between 0 and 5 and 20 and 29, i.e. young families that had grown up in this country. When we did further focus group analysis, what we saw was, coming back to my shopping example, that when Mohammed or Asma falls off the slide, unlike other kinds of families where it's just the parents or, frankly, the nanny who decides what to do, in these families, it's a family decision. And the older members of those families, presumably bringing a habit or an attitude they have from the subcontinent, don't think of GPs who are young, do not wear white coats, address you by your first name, sit in offices as proper doctors. They're kids. Proper doctors are people who are in hospitals, have lots of nurses running around behind them, give you lots of intrusive tests, and that's how you know you're going to be better. Well, actually, is it just a hypothesis? Well, actually, the Primary Healthcare Trust did some fantastic work targeting these families and so on, educational campaigns. They brought down the overuse by nearly 7% within a year. And control hospitals nearby had overuse figures that were going up by 3 or 4% a year. So actually, we think that we called it right. And that's because there's a real difference. And the current issue, which again I haven't got time to go into, Avon and Somerset Police, not enough minority candidates getting through their recruitment tests. They called in the Behavioural Insight Unit. They changed one line or one step in the process, which was to write a particular letter to all candidates, not just minority candidates, in this process. They adjusted the tone of the reminder. It's pretty much a no-cost intervention. It had the effect of increasing the pass rate amongst ethnic minorities by 50% and eliminated the gap in pass rates between whites and non-whites. The point is that we're now learning that problems that we thought could be solved by legal or regulatory means may be better addressed by other means. I want lastly to deal with the issue that I called the dilemma of diversity. It's one that we have difficulties in this country because we don't like, frankly, I know this is a bad expression to use in this context, but you'll understand what I'm saying. We have difficulty calling a spade a spade. My wife and I got invited to government, big thing, state, one of these country houses that they have, ministers have. They said it's an informal supper. Now, in their informal supper, to me, means 5 of your mates round with a bottle of wine, 4 o'clock in the morning, you push them out the door. In this case, you get a stiff card and it says informal supper, here's your dress, And at the bottom it says no dress code. And my wife said to me, no dress code, what does that mean? And I say, oh, well, it's what you feel like. And she looked at me, as your wife sometimes does. You're an idiot, aren't you? For a bloke, it's no tie, fine. For a woman, there are at least 27 variations of. So we rang round. Everybody was really, really, really uniformly nice and utterly unhelpful. So she wore what she thought was right, and being a woman of taste and discernment, it went very well. But actually, I realised after that episode, we don't like to deal with these issues because what that invitation actually said was, if you don't know what the dress code is, you really shouldn't be coming. What we believe here is that actually we don't need to deal with these things. Now, my point here is we are going to be faced with these issues, and we have to address them. And big data is showing us some of the issues that are really going to smack us in the face. 2 or 3, well, I was going to say trivial ones. They may not be trivial to everybody in this room. The dating site OkCupid in the United States has revealed something very interesting about dating. 10 million transactions. What does it tell you? It tells you that all men prefer dating Asian women except for Asian men. No idea why, but that's the case. All women prefer dating white men except black women, who are, as in many other respects, just exceptional and annoying. Listen, I've got 6 sisters. I'm allowed to say that. We know things now. We know that if you want to sell cars to South Asians, then you can paint them a particular colour. I'm not going to tell you which one it is, because you have to pay for that. We know that some cultures prefer to avoid contact sports. The fact that South Asian boys don't do football, but they do cricket, isn't entirely an accident or to do with discrimination. We are going to have to deal with some of these issues. We're going to have to deal with the fact, and here is where it becomes very, very serious. Data confronts us with uncomfortable and consistent findings. In most ethnic groups, when it comes to Key Stage 4, GCSE, there's 20% gap between performance of the poor and the average student. There's one demographic exception. Children of Chinese heritage, where the poor not poor gap is just 2%. And frankly, it doesn't matter anyway, because poor Chinese children, 90% of whom get 5 good GCSE, beat the pants off every other demographic, affluent or not. The hard question here is, and you will struggle to find any serious study of this question in this country. The hard question is, what do they have that the rest of us don't? And if we could understand it, could we copy it? Do we just regard it as an unjust inequality that would encourage some form of reverse discrimination? And by the way, before we get into that conversation, this is not a socio-economic feature. We know that. But we do not want to ask the question because it's too difficult. School choice, creating a rather different experience of integration. Again, I haven't got time to go into that, but I want to give you 3 things to think about the workplace. These differences are going to be real for organizations to deal with. How do organizations deal with the fact that work that's been done by the Center for Talent Innovation in the United States, 45% of African Americans, Hispanics, say they feel they have to compromise their authenticity at work. So do 35% of Asians. What are we not doing that would make those people feel it's okay to bring themselves to work? What are we not doing that allows leaderships in businesses to have a proper conversation about race in the way they do about gender? And what are we not doing that means that whilst we are making progress on gender, one of the emerging features of the data is that companies that do well on gender in their leadership do very badly on ethnicity in their leadership, and actually vice versa. But of course, at the moment, it leans all that way because a lot of energy has gone into responding to the Davis report and so on. For individuals, there's a deal to be made. We bring ourselves to work. Do we speak in the common language of our organizations, or do we somehow try to change that? What in America they call now the dilemma of code switching. I'm the 10th son of immigrants from Finsbury Park. I don't, I guess, present like one because I've learnt the common language. Should I have to? How do we change the narrative about people of difference? In the United States, we did some work for a big British company, actually, who found that their African-American executives left them at a particular level. We think the reason was, I know I'm finishing, we think the reason was that they carried with them a narrative of trouble. At some point in the past, there had been a legal case about discrimination. In the company, the culture was now that these guys, even if they were very nice, might cause you trouble. And they were treated as such and talked to as such, even if people didn't think that's what they were doing. How do you solve it? Well, actually, what we recommended, we don't know if it's going to work, is basically take some of those people out of the context of the United States so they could stop being, in their own heads, African Americans who carried that narrative, send them to Azerbaijan, send them to Brazil, bring them to London. And interestingly enough, when they go back, in everybody's heads, they themselves abroad become Americans rather than African Americans. So their narrative changes. When they go back, we think that they will also become different people in the companies. These are difficult and tricky issues. Last point. All of us are going to have the courage to do what the Hollywood executive David Geffen does at the end of every meeting, or did at the end of every meeting, which is to ask this question: what haven't we asked ourselves? For example, in politics, within 10 years, I think, half of the people who vote Labour in this country, may come even faster looking at the data right now, but at least on long-term trend, half the people who vote Labour in this country will not be white. Is that party looking like a party that has noticed that? Secondly, here is the most tricky one. Evidence emerging from the United States, health field, says that if you want people to follow a course of remedies, antibiotics, whatever it is, then have it administered by someone that they recognize as feeling like them. Same race, same gender, and so on. In the United States, the misuse or underuse of antibiotics costs $30 billion a year. Now, only a part of that, of course, is due to people not completing the course. But even if it was $2 billion a year, and you could save that by what they call now concordance, matching the patient to the caregiver, should we do that? So, for example, would you put a little lever, a little algorithm in the booking program for GPs that matches doctors to patients? If it were going to save you $2 billion a year. I don't know the answer, but I hope that is what clever academics sitting in this room will provide for us. Thank you.